Welcome to the last session of our study in the themes of Isaiah. If you've made it all the way through with us, go ahead and get yourself a I Survived Isaiah t-shirt. Okay, you deserve it. So in our last session, we focused in on his prophecies that deal with the birth, the suffering, and the death of the Messiah, which is amazing because that was 700 years before Jesus took on flesh. Now, we didn't talk about the term Messiah. You won't find it littered all throughout the Old Testament, but it's basically a term that we use that means the anointed one, or God's chosen and anointed person. So the idea of a Messiah can actually refer to a lot of different people at different times. It's usually a special person that God has set apart for a very critical moment in the life of his people. So if we think about it that way, there's a lot of different people who over the course of history operated in a Messiah-like role in the life of the people. The kings of Judah were all considered God's anointed ones, okay? So, as we said last week, with Isaiah's prophecies, he had a near fulfillment and then a further fulfillment where the near fulfillment kind of foreshadowed the ultimate or further fulfillment. We see that in Jesus. Isaiah prophesied about a virgin birth that would stand out as an unusual sign. Well, the birth of Jesus is about the ultimate unusual standout kind of a birth. Isaiah prophesied that a child would be born that would represent the idea of God being with us. Well, Jesus is kind of the ultimate form of God being with us. There may have been other leaders throughout the history of Israel that suffered greatly for their people, but as the idea of Jesus and the Messiah that's predicted is going to suffer greatly, well, Jesus is like that ultimate example of suffering and dying on behalf of other people. In other words, Jesus is the ultimate. Now, some of Isaiah's prophecies, like we said, deal with his own time, which is the first horizon. Some of them deal with the time of the New Testament, which is the second horizon. But tonight we turn our attention toward the third horizon, which are a number of things that we, even now, are still looking forward to. After Jesus' resurrection, he appeared to his disciples for about 40 days on and off, and the very last moment before he's taken up into heaven is recorded in several places in the New Testament. Acts chapter 1, starting at verse 6, says this, "So when they had come together, they asked him, 'Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom of Israel?' He said to them, 'It is not for you to know times or seasons that the Father has fixed by his own authority. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth.' And when he had said these things, as they were looking on, he was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of their sight. And while they were gazing into heaven as he went, behold, two men stood by them in white robes and said, 'Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking into heaven? This Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven.'" Now picture this in your mind. The disciples have been with Jesus over 3 years at this point. They've seen a lot, but they had to be wondering what comes next. And for good Jewish boys, they had a good picture in their minds of what that could be. Now, not all the gospel writers record it this way. Some just tell us that it was the Great Commission, and some show us the ascension. But when Matthew tells it, he says that some worshiped Jesus at this moment, but some still doubted. Now, you have to be thinking when you read this, how in the world, after everything these guys have been through, after everything that they have seen, how could they still be doubting? Well, remember we said that Jesus didn't go around shouting, "I'm the Messiah, I'm the Messiah." Instead, he carefully went around doing the things that the prophets said the Messiah would do. The problem is that up to this point, Jesus hadn't actually done everything that the prophets said the Messiah would do. There are very specific things that were still left out on the table. So if you're a disciple, you have to be thinking, okay, he's done like 80% of the things. Now he's about to do the things that are left for the Messiah to do. That's why they asked the question about restoring the kingdom of Israel. As we will see, this is a significant component of the prophecies about the Messiah. And up to this point, it hadn't happened yet. So Jesus' response to them is basically not a denial that it's going to happen. He just basically tells them, you don't need to know about that right now. Nobody knows when it's going to happen, and you don't need to worry about it right now. So, you would think that after seeing absolutely everything that these guys had seen, that they would just go ahead and believe in Jesus regardless. But there was still room for them to maybe not believe. Here's the reality. God always gives us a way out. There's always something that we could point to as a reason to not believe. Up to this point, the disciples had a lot of reason to believe, but there was still a little bit that Jesus hadn't done yet, so there was still a little room for doubt in the minds of some people. Think about it like this. If every time you prayed, God instantly provided the answer, if every time there was a problem in your life, God instantly showed up and fixed it, why would you need faith? You wouldn't. Faith is what we display when we continue to move in God's direction, even though everything is not wrapped up neatly with a little bow on top. Faith is how we look forward while we are waiting on God to do the things that He promised He would do. But there's always something that we could point to as an excuse to not believe or to not trust. One of the great hymns of the church says that one day our faith shall be sight. And when we're all in heaven, we won't need to have faith anymore. But until then, we have to choose to believe. Faith is always a choice. So these disciples had a lot of reason to believe that Jesus was the real deal, but there could still be a little wiggle room in there because He hadn't fulfilled absolutely everything the prophets said the Messiah would do. But when Jesus was taken up into heaven and the angels appeared and told the disciples, hey, the same way He went up, you're going to see Him come down. Well, this is significant because at that moment they were standing on the Mount of Olives. Well, in the 14th chapter of Zechariah, he records this. On that day, His feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall split in two from east to west by a very wide valley, so that on one half of the mountain shall move northward and the other half southward. So even though Jesus had not up to that point done everything that they thought the Messiah would do, even the way that He goes up and what the angels say to the disciples is yet another confirmation that He is the real deal and that He is going to come just like Zechariah said, and He's going to stand on that place that they were standing. He's going to come down the same way that He went up. So they didn't have the whole picture, but they had pieces, and they had enough to believe. Well, if we went through all of the scriptures and tried to piece together everything that it says about what the Messiah is going to do and what the last days are going to be like and all the end times prophecies, that would be way more than we have time to deal with right now. So we're only going to briefly concern ourselves with the things that Isaiah has to contribute to that conversation. Now, I'm going to give you a super brief overview just so that you kind of understand, and not all of the things that I'm going to say every single evangelical tradition agrees with, but these are kind of the basic ways of understanding the major events of the end times, okay? So, basically, we all believe that as Christians, Jesus is going to come back for His church. We call it the rapture. And some believe that after the rapture of the church, there'll be a great time of tribulation on the earth. Then after the tribulation, the Lord will come in His official second coming. Okay, so the second coming is His official time after the tribulation, where He comes and He vanquishes all of His foes, including Satan, who is thrown into the abyss for 1,000 years. And on the earth, physically, Jesus reigns for 1,000 years in what we know as the Millennial Reign. After that, there's a great battle that ensues where Satan is ultimately defeated and thrown into the lake of fire. And then there's a new heaven and a new earth, and we enter into our eternal state. Now, I know I just oversimplified a whole lot of things, but I just said that to give you the gist of what we're going to be peeking into tonight. Now, Isaiah made some specific contributions to certain slices of this, so let's look at Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6 and 7, which is part of the book of Emmanuel that we referred to last week. He says, "For unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this." Now, in this passage, which we normally think of during the Christmas season, we actually have a perfect example of Isaiah prophesying about two totally different time periods: the first coming of Christ and the second coming of Christ. The first verse section talks about a child being born. This speaks of the humanity of Jesus. But the second part says that a son is given. We should think of John 3:16 there. This speaks of His only begotten Son. God gives His Son. It speaks of Jesus' divinity. But once we pass that Christmas part of this verse, we move into a totally different phase of the Messianic prophecy that Jesus didn't fulfill in His earthly life. It says that the government shall be on His shoulders. It's a reference to the cloak that a king would wear upon his shoulders. It represented His burden. You've heard people say that it was His burden to bear, or you've heard people refer to the burden of responsibility. It's the weight of responsibility that a king has when he has to decide different things about his kingdom. But we don't see Jesus coming as a king the first time. We don't see the weight of the kingdom on His shoulders in that same way. We don't see Him governing as a monarch. Well, when He does come to govern as a monarch, we will see Him as Wonderful Counselor. And this doesn't just mean that He gives great advice, but He gives wonderful advice, wonderful counsel based on perfect knowledge. See, I've counseled a lot of people, and it's difficult sometimes to pick apart whether people are telling you the truth or whether they're telling you only selective parts of the story and leaving out very relevant details. Well, when Jesus gives counsel, it's based on perfect knowledge. He knows the whole story from beginning to end, so He truly is a wonderful counselor. He is also a mighty God, or a powerful God, as some versions say. Now, we don't often think of Jesus as a father, but yet Isaiah says he'll be thought of as an everlasting Father. This speaks of His pre-existence even before His physical birth in the Christmas story. And we would never refer to a normal human being in that way. He'll be called the Prince of Peace because He will reign over an incredible time of peace upon the earth that we refer to as the Millennial Reign. And verse 7 specifically talks about Him sitting on the throne of David. Now, this should end any debate of whether His kingdom is purely spiritual and metaphorical and is not going to be a literal physical kingdom in the lineage of David. This is why when Matthew and Luke give us the genealogy of Jesus in their Gospels, they make sure to include that He is of the line of David. Consider the words of the angel who spoke to Mary when he announced that Mary was going to have a son. In Luke chapter 1, verse 32, it says, "He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give to him the throne of his father David. And he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end." Well, doesn't that sound familiar? So the New Testament is careful to show us that Jesus is the Messiah because of what he does, and because the prophets prophesy that he will be of the line of David, and Jesus is that. So the New Testament echoes that he is those things and does those things. So Jesus also gives us an indication that there is a difference between his earthly ministry and what he would later do in the future. Remember, in a few sessions ago, we talked about Isaiah 61, where it talks about the Spirit of the Lord being upon God's anointed. And so Jesus quotes that when he goes to the synagogue in Nazareth, in his hometown. The thing is, though, when Jesus read from that scroll, he conveniently left out a part. He kind of read a section and then he stopped just shy of a very significant part of the verse. So I'm going to read Isaiah 61 for you, but I'm going to highlight on the screen the part that Jesus left out. Isaiah 61 verse 1 says, "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor," and here's the part, "and the day of vengeance of our God." See, when Luke told the story, he says, after Jesus said the year of the Lord's favor, well, right there, he rolled up the scroll and said, hey, this has been fulfilled in your hearing. He didn't mention the day of vengeance of our God, because Jesus wasn't dealing with that part yet. The first part had been fulfilled. Jesus was there in the power of the Spirit, but the day of vengeance, well, that part hadn't come yet. Because this is a day when the Jews expected that their king would come and he would punish all the nations for how they had risen up against Israel. He would pay them back for what they had done toward the people of God. But Jesus stopped short of saying that that part had been fulfilled in their hearing, because they were still waiting for that. So when we think of the prophecies of Isaiah that include both the first and second coming, Isaiah is basically standing at a mountain range, and he's seeing all of the mountaintops together in one big picture. Now, I was a youth pastor in New Mexico, in Farmington, and we were really close to the Colorado border, so we would go up to Durango, Colorado with our students. We'd go on several trips there up in the mountains, and it's beautiful, it's vast, it's breathtaking, and it looks different depending on where you're standing. Your viewpoint dictates what parts you can see and how much. So when we think of the prophecies of Isaiah, it's like Isaiah is standing in front of all of these mountains and they're lined up before him. He can see the tops of the mountains, but what he can't see is all of the gaps in between the mountains. He doesn't know which ones are connected to each other and which ones have large valleys in between and how big those valleys are, how far they are apart. When in his view, he's seeing them all as one big picture, so he gives us the highlights. Those are the mountaintops. But he doesn't see the gaps in between. Well, those are all the time periods that separate some of these highlights. So Isaiah can say in one paragraph or in one sentence statements that seem like they're referring to the same time period, and yet they're actually referring to multiple time periods, and it's the New Testament that gives us a much clearer picture about the distance between these things. Now, when it comes to the kingdom, I know that some will object and say that according to John 18, verse 36, Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." But when you look at the context of that particular passage, he's really speaking about how he wasn't going to just break in and send the army and take the kingdom by force. He was referring to how his kingdom worked differently than how we should expect the kingdoms of the earth to function. But he wasn't precluding the reality of a physical, literal kingdom that would come in the future. When we consider Isaiah chapter 11, it's also a prophetic passage that deals with the reign of the Messiah during what we call the Millennial Reign. Let's read several verses here, starting in the 11th chapter, verse 1. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide disputes by what his ears hear. But with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt of his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fatted calf together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together. The lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the otter's den. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Now, when a tree is cut down, typically we consider that's the end of that tree's life. But sometimes, depending on the type of tree, there can spring up one little shoot on an otherwise dead, dry-looking stump. Isaiah here is basically saying that at a time when Israel is cut down and looks dead and dry, there's going to come a little glimmer of hope. A little shoot will come up, and it will turn into a branch, and it will bear fruit. Now, this is a picture of the Messiah, and branch is a term that Isaiah uses in multiple places to refer to the Messiah. This is also a place where Isaiah refers to the power of the Spirit at work in and through the Messiah. If you listed them out here in verses 2 and 3, there are essentially 7 things. There's the Spirit of the Lord, of wisdom, of understanding, of counsel, of might, of the knowledge of the Lord, and the fear of the Lord. And some see a parallel here between this and the 7 spirits that are associated with Jesus in the book of Revelation, chapter 1, verse 4, and chapter 5, verse 6. Luke's gospel is really the gospel of the Spirit, but long before Luke told us in Luke chapter 4 that after Jesus' temptation, he went out ministering in the power of the Spirit, Isaiah showed us the power of the Spirit in all of its completeness at work in and through the Messiah. When Messiah comes a second time, in verse 4 of Isaiah chapter 11, he tells us that he shall strike the earth with a rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he'll kill the wicked. This is at the start of the millennial reign. It's basically a time where Jesus comes to the earth and he clears house. And he then ushers in a season of unprecedented peace. In 2003, the New York Times published a series of articles on war. Now, I don't know how they figured this out. I don't know who did the math on this and who counted, but one of the articles boldly proclaimed that of the past 3,400 years, humans have been entirely at peace for 268 of them, or just 8% of recorded history. Now, see, in the millennial reign, we're not going to have 8%. Peace is not going to be the oddity in human history. No, peace is going to be the norm, and it's going to be a literal 1,000 years of peace. And the book of Revelations, chapter 20, is where we get that idea of a literal 1,000 years. But just before Revelations chapter 20, there takes place a great battle where Satan and his false prophet and the beast are defeated. And listen to the very last verse of chapter 19 in the book of Revelation. Chapter 19, verse 21. And the rest were slain by the sword that came from the mouth of him who was sitting on the horse, and all the birds were gorged with their flesh. Do you see how the book of Revelation is echoing what Isaiah said? That basically the rod of his mouth, the breath of his lips, this is how he's going to vanquish his foes. Now, the rest of Isaiah chapter 11 describes what life is going to be like on the earth during the millennial reign. Now, for starters, life will actually be fair. That's because Messiah will reign over a fair, just, and equitable world because he will be its king. In some ways, the world will go back to the state that it was similar to in the garden, which is what God intended. Since the fall of man, the world has become hostile and violent. Even creation has been affected by the sin in the world, which is why the Apostle Paul wrote in Romans chapter 8, verse 19, "For creation waits the eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. For the creation has been subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God." I mean, think of this. Creation itself is looking for this time where it can be free, where it can go back to the way it was supposed to be. You would never let a young child play in a field where you know there are deadly cobras in that field. And yet, during the millennial reign, that won't matter. See, in the millennial reign, we won't have this adversarial relationship with creation, and creation won't have an adversarial relationship even with itself. Now, I don't claim to understand how all of that works, but I think it's pretty safe to say from these verses that during the millennial reign of Christ, the world is just going to operate differently and respond differently to us, and the people alive on the earth at that time will respond differently to creation. Isaiah also sees in his vision this idea of a new Jerusalem. Isaiah 54, starting at verse 11. "Suffering one, storm-tossed, uncomforted, look, I am setting your gemstones in silvery metal, and your foundations with sapphire. I will make your towers of rubies, and your gates of beryl, and all your walls of precious jewels." Now, according to the description that we have of the New Jerusalem in the book of Revelation, it's strikingly similar. It's like Isaiah is seeing a glimpse of what the New Jerusalem will look like in Revelation chapter 21. "The wall is built of jasper, while the city is pure gold, clear as glass. The foundation of the wall of the city are adorned with every jewel. The first was jasper, the second sapphire, the third agate, the fourth emerald, the fifth onyx, the sixth carnelian, the seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, the ninth topaz, the 10th chrysoprase, if I said that right, the 11th jacinth, the 12th amethyst. And the 12 gates are 12 pearls. Each of the gates is a single pearl, and the street of the city is pure gold, transparent as glass." Can you see when you compare these two passages that it's like Isaiah catches a little glimpse of the New Jerusalem, and then John, in his revelation, he sees even more full detail as he begins to describe this New Jerusalem. In Isaiah 65, we even get a glimpse of what's going to happen after the millennial reign. He says, "For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former things shall not be remembered or come into mind. But be glad and rejoice forever in that which I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem to be a joy, and her people to be a gladness. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and be glad in my people. No more shall be heard in it the sound of weeping and the cry of distress. Compare that to what John says in Revelation 21, verse 1. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the former heaven and the former earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. I heard a loud voice from the throne say, Look, God's dwelling place is here with humankind. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. There will be no more mourning, crying, or pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. Wow. Isaiah saw bits and pieces of what the New Testament gives us a little more detail about. It's amazing to consider that 700 years before the birth of Jesus, Isaiah caught glimpses of the Messiah. And not only did he catch glimpses of the Messiah in the New Testament times, but he even caught glimpses far beyond that, things that we are still looking forward to and longing for. They're still out there, and they're still going to happen, and Jesus is still going to be the center of those things. I want to encourage you. Books like this, prophecy books, they should serve not as a source of frustration because we don't always understand all the details and how it's all put together. They should serve as comfort to us and reassurance to us that we serve a God who is in total command of history. He is directing the course of time according to his purposes and his plans, and we all get to be a part of it. And all we need to do is align our hearts with what God has laid out there for us, because God is watching over it to perform it. Now, I want to just take a moment and encourage you. Prophecy in the Old Testament is a bit different than what we see as prophecy in the New Testament. There are significant changes that are made. We don't see people operating in the same way that Elijah or Elisha did. And the truth is, even in the Old Testament, we see prophecy changing over time, because after Elijah and Elisha, we don't see people operating quite in that way. Even in the Old Testament times, they weren't writing prophets. They performed lots of miracles. And yet we see later on the writing prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah. There are several prophets who were writing prophets that didn't perform miracles at all, but they saw visions from God and they recorded those things about their time and about things that were going to come. So even in the Old Testament, we see that God changed how he dealt with prophets and this spiritual gift of prophecy. So we shouldn't be surprised that when God ushers in his new phase of his program in the New Testament, that the gift of prophecy is still there and it's still important, but it's a little different. Gone are the days where prophets are condemning nations and putting blessings and cursings on nations. We don't so much see that in the New Testament. Instead, we see prophecy being very personal. We see prophecy being more about encouraging and strengthening and building up, which, yes, sometimes includes rebuke, but only for the sake of correcting and strengthening the church. We should expect then that in the New Testament times and in our times, that God deals with prophets and prophecy very differently. So we shouldn't expect prophets today to act in the same way that prophets did in the past. The day of Pentecost, if I can use a football term, it ushered in the 2-minute warning the 2-minute drill of God's program. In the last 2 minutes of a football game, the goal of the game remains the same: score and prevent the other team from scoring. But some of the rules slightly change. And because the rules slightly change in the last 2 minutes of a football game, teams have to play the game a little bit differently. And that's why they practice what they call the 2-minute drill, because it's different than the rest of the game, even though the goal remains the same. We are living, friends, in the 2-minute warning. We are in those last 2 minutes, those great last days. God's program has slightly changed a little bit, but the goal is still the same. We serve the same God, and we're all driving toward the same thing. But we have to understand that things are a little bit different now than they were in the Old Testament times, and that's completely okay. Listen, I love you. I hope you've gotten a lot out of this study. I hope it's been a blessing to you. May God bless you as you read books of prophecy and speak to you in a deeply personal way. God bless.